February 21st, 1951. West Oakland, California. The morning fog rolled in from San Francisco Bay like a living thing, its gray tendrils weaving between the modest houses of West Oakland with the patience of a predator. Street lamps flickered in the pre-dawn darkness, casting amber pools of light that barely penetrated the thick mist. The air carried the scent of salt water mixed with the industrial smoke from the shipyards, a reminder that this neighborhood existed in the shadow of America's post-war boom, where working families scraped together dreams from honest labor and stubborn hope. In a small house on 7th Street, 6-year-old Luis Albino stirred in his narrow bed, his dark eyes reflecting the pale light filtering through thin curtains. The house creaked around him like a ship at anchor, filled with the familiar sounds of his large family beginning another day. His mother's voice drifted from the kitchen in rapid Spanish, punctuated by the clatter of pots and the hiss of coffee brewing on the stove. Luis smiled, recognizing the rhythm of home, a symphony he had known all his short life. Luis was a beautiful child, with the kind of face that made strangers stop and comment. His olive skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and his smile could melt the hardest hearts in the neighborhood. His thick black hair fell in waves across his forehead, and when he laughed, which was often, his whole face transformed with joy. He was the kind of child who collected friends like other children collected marbles, drawing adults and children alike into his orbit with an irresistible combination of innocence and charm. The Albino family had come to Oakland from Portugal's Azores Islands, part of the wave of immigrants who arrived seeking the American dream in the years following the war. Antonio Albino worked the docks, his weathered hands telling the story of countless hours loading and unloading ships. His wife Maria took in sewing to supplement their income, her fingers dancing across fabric late into the night while her children slept. They were a proud family, poor in money but rich in love, bound together by traditions that stretched back generations and dreams that reached toward a future they could barely imagine. Luis was the youngest of their children, preceded by older siblings who doted on him with the fierce protectiveness that characterized large immigrant families. His sister Rosa, 15 and already showing signs of the beauty that would make her the talk of the neighborhood, braided his hair each morning with gentle fingers. His brothers, Miguel and Joao, taught him to kick a soccer ball and throw a baseball, preparing him for the American childhood they hoped would open doors that had remained closed to them. On this particular morning, as the fog began its slow retreat toward the bay, Maria Albino moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency. She had risen before dawn, as she did every day, to prepare breakfast for her family and pack lunches for those who would spend their day working. The smell of frying linguiça filled the small kitchen, mixing with the aroma of fresh bread she had baked the night before. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind was elsewhere, on the bills that needed paying, the rent that was due, the countless small worries that filled the hours of a mother trying to keep her family afloat in an uncertain world. "Luis," she called, her voice carrying the musical accent that marked her as foreign in a country that was still learning to embrace its immigrants. "Ven aquí, mijo. Come ahí." The sound of small feet hitting the floor echoed through the house, followed by the rapid patter of Luis running toward the kitchen. He appeared in the doorway like a burst of sunshine, his hair disheveled from sleep, his face bright with the promise of a new day. He wore the clothes Maria had laid out for him the night before, clean but patched pants, a shirt that had belonged to his older brother, and shoes that had been resoled twice but still managed to look respectable. "Good morning, Mame," he said, sliding into his chair at the small wooden table that had seen countless family meals. The table bore the scars of daily use, ring stains from countless cups, scratches from knives, and the soft depression where Antonio rested his elbows while reading the newspaper each evening. Maria smiled, her face softening as she looked at her youngest child. There was something special about Luis that she couldn't quite name, a light in his eyes that seemed to promise great things, a gentleness in his nature that made her believe he was destined for something beyond the hard life that had shaped his parents. She placed a plate in front of him, watching with satisfaction as his eyes widened at the generous portion of eggs and sausage. "Eat quickly, Mijo," she said, ruffling his hair with one flour-dusted hand. "Rosa will walk you to the park today while I finish Mrs. Henderson's dress. But you must promise to stay close to your sister, see?" Luis nodded enthusiastically, his mouth already full of breakfast. The park was his favorite place in the world, a small patch of green in the urban landscape where he could run and play with the other children from the neighborhood. It was where he had learned to climb trees and catch fireflies, where he had made his first friends and scraped his first knees. The park represented freedom to Luis, a place where the boundaries that confined him at home dissolved into endless possibility. "Can we feed the ducks?" he asked, his words slightly muffled by food. "If you have bread left from lunch," Maria replied, already moving on to prepare breakfast for the rest of the family. "But remember what I told you about strangers, Louise. You stay with Rosa always. There are people in this world." She paused, searching for words that would convey caution without instilling fear. "Just stay close to your sister." Antonio appeared in the kitchen doorway, his massive frame filling the space like a mountain. He was a man built by hard labor, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his family's dreams and hands that could be gentle as feathers when he touched his children. His face bore the lines of a man who had seen both joy and sorrow, but his eyes still held the spark of optimism that had brought him across an ocean in search of a better life. "Morning, little man," he said, his English carefully pronounced but still colored by his native Portuguese. He reached down to tussle Luis's hair, a gesture so familiar it had become ritual. "You be good for your sister today. Understand?" "Si, papai," Luis replied, beaming up at his father with the unconditional adoration that children reserve for their heroes. Antonio studied his youngest son for a moment, struck by something he couldn't quite identify. There was an intensity to Luis's gaze this morning, as if the child was trying to memorize every detail of the moment. It was probably nothing. Children often had that focused look when they were excited about something, but it made Antonio pause. "I love you, son," he said suddenly, the words carrying more weight than usual. "I love you too, papai," Luis replied, his voice small but certain. The morning progressed with the familiar rhythm of a working-class household preparing for the day. Rosa emerged from the bedroom she shared with her youngest brother, already dressed in her school clothes and ready to take on the responsibility of watching Luis at the park. At 15, she moved with the grace of approaching womanhood, but retained enough childlike enthusiasm to genuinely enjoy spending time with her little brother. "Ready for an adventure?" she asked Luis, taking his hand as they prepared to leave the house. Luis nodded eagerly, practically bouncing with excitement. The fog had lifted enough to reveal patches of blue sky, and the promise of sunshine made the day seem full of infinite possibility. He clutched the small paper bag that contained his lunch, a sandwich made with Maria's homemade bread, an apple and a cookie that Rosa had secretly added when their mother wasn't looking. Maria watched from the front window as her two youngest children walked down 7th Street toward the park, Rosa's protective hand firmly grasping Luis's smaller one. Something twisted in her stomach, a mother's intuition that she couldn't quite explain. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural worry that came with letting her children out of her sight in a world that sometimes seemed hostile to people like them. The West Oakland neighborhood was a tapestry of cultures and dreams, where Portuguese immigrants lived alongside Mexican families, African Americans who had come north seeking better opportunities, and the occasional Anglo family that hadn't yet fled to the suburbs. The streets buzzed with the energy of people building new lives from the ground up, children playing games that transcended language barriers, and women hanging laundry while sharing gossip and advice. Luis knew every crack in the sidewalk between his house and the park, every friendly dog that would wag its tail as he passed, every elderly neighbor who would wave from front porches. This was his world, small but complete, bounded by love and made rich by the simple pleasures of childhood. As he walked with Rosa, he pointed out things that caught his attention. A cat sleeping in a window. A colorful flower pushing up through a crack in the concrete. An airplane drawing white lines across the clearing sky. "Look, Rosa," he exclaimed, tugging on his sister's hand. "The plane is writing in the sky." Rosa smiled, charmed by her brother's wonder at things she had long since stopped noticing. "What do you think it's writing?" she asked. Luis considered this seriously, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Maybe it's writing, 'Have a good day, Luis.'" "Maybe it is," Rosa agreed, squeezing his hand gently. The park came into view as they turned the corner onto San Pablo Avenue, a modest rectangle of grass and trees that served as the community's outdoor living room. Children were already scattered across the playground equipment, their voices creating a cheerful cacophony that mixed with the distant sounds of traffic and industry. Luis's pace quickened as he spotted familiar faces among the children, friends he had made during countless afternoons spent climbing and running and imagining. "Can I go play on the swings?" he asked, already pulling toward the playground equipment. "Stay where I can see you," Rosa replied, settling onto a bench that gave her a clear view of the entire play area. She pulled out a book from her school bag, but her eyes remained alert, tracking her brother's movements with the vigilance that comes from being the oldest child in a family where watching out for siblings was not just expected, but essential. Luis ran toward the swings with the unbridled joy that characterized everything he did. He was immediately surrounded by friends, children from the neighborhood who recognized him as one of their own. There was Tommy, the red-haired Irish boy, whose father worked at the shipyard with Antonio, Carmen, a Mexican girl whose grandmother made the best tamales in Oakland, and James, an African-American boy whose mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the hills. The children played with the natural integration that adults found so difficult, their games unmarked by the prejudices and divisions that defined the grown-up world. They spoke a mixture of English, Spanish, and Portuguese, creating their own language of childhood that transcended the barriers their parents sometimes faced. For 2 hours, Luis played with the abandon that only children can achieve. He soared on the swings, his laughter carrying across the park like music. He climbed the monkey bars with determined concentration, his tongue poking out slightly as he focused on moving from rung to rung. He played elaborate games of tag that evolved into even more elaborate games of imagination, where the playground became a castle or a pirate ship or a rocket ship bound for distant planets. Rosa watched it all with the particular joy that comes from seeing someone you love experiencing pure happiness. She found herself thinking about her own childhood, which seemed both recent and impossibly distant. The weight of growing up in an immigrant family meant that childhood ended earlier than it might have for other children. There were always responsibilities to shoulder, languages to navigate, cultural bridges to build and maintain. But Luis seemed to exist in a bubble of innocence that even their family's struggles couldn't entirely penetrate. He approached the world with such open-hearted trust that it made Rosa both protective and slightly envious. She wanted to preserve that innocence for as long as possible, to give him the childhood that circumstances had abbreviated for her. At around noon, as the February sun reached its highest point and began to cast shorter shadows, Rosa called Luis over for lunch. He came running, his cheeks flushed with exercise and happiness, his hair damp with perspiration despite the cool air. "I'm having the best day ever," he announced, settling beside his sister on the bench. "I can tell," Rosa replied, smiling at his enthusiasm. She helped him unwrap his sandwich, making sure he ate slowly enough to actually taste his food. "What's been the best part?" Luis considered this question with the seriousness of a philosopher. "All of it," he finally decided, "but especially when Tommy and I pretended to be explorers and found treasure under the slide." "What kind of treasure?" "A bottle cap and a really smooth rock," Luis replied, as if these were precious gems. "Tommy said I could keep the rock because I saw it first." Rosa laughed, charmed by the simple equation that turned refuse into treasure in a child's imagination. She watched Luis eat his lunch, noting the careful way he saved half his cookie for later, a habit that spoke to the unconscious frugality that children from poor families develop without even realizing it. "Can I go play some more after lunch?" Luis asked, his mouth full of apple. A little more, Rosa agreed. But we need to be home before Mamaya starts worrying. Luis nodded eagerly and bounded back toward the playground, where his friends were already calling his name. Rosa settled back against the bench, her book forgotten, as she watched her brother rejoin the group of children. The afternoon sun felt warm on her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the perfect ordinariness of the day. That was when she noticed the man. He stood at the edge of the park, partially concealed by the shadow of a large oak tree. There was nothing obviously threatening about him. He was well dressed in a dark coat and hat, and he appeared to be watching the children play with the same benign interest that many adults showed when passing by playgrounds. But something about his stillness caught Rosa's attention, the way he remained in one spot for longer than casual interest would warrant. Rosa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. She stood up from the bench, trying to get a better look at the man while keeping Luis in her peripheral vision. The stranger was middle-aged, with pale skin and brown hair visible beneath his hat. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his posture suggested patience, the kind of waiting that implied purpose rather than idle observation. Their eyes met across the park, and Rosa felt her stomach drop. There was something in his gaze that made her skin crawl, not overtly menacing, but calculating in a way that set off every alarm bell her 15 years had taught her to recognize. The man didn't look away when he realized she was watching him. Instead, he smiled, an expression that was meant to be reassuring but somehow managed to be the opposite. "Luis," Rosa called, her voice sharper than she intended. Luis looked up from where he was playing with Tommy near the monkey bars, his face questioning. Rosa forced herself to smile and wave, not wanting to alarm him but needing him closer. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a primitive warning system that made her want to gather her brother and run. The man began walking toward the playground. Rosa's heart started beating faster. She told herself she was being paranoid, that there was nothing inherently suspicious about a man walking through a public park. But her instincts screamed otherwise, and she had learned to trust those instincts in a world that wasn't always kind to young women or the children they protected. "Luis, come here for a minute," she called again, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made several children look up. But Luis was deep in conversation with Tommy about something of vital 6-year-old importance, and the noise of the playground swallowed Rosa's words. She started walking toward him, her eyes darting between her brother and the approaching stranger. The man was closer now, close enough for Rosa to see the details of his face. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His clothes were expensive, better quality than anything worn by the families who lived in this neighborhood. He walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his steps deliberate and measured. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the park. "Little boy." Several children turned at the sound, including Luis. The man was looking directly at him, his smile widening in what was clearly meant to be a friendly expression. Rosa broke into a run. "Luis," she shouted, no longer caring about causing a scene. "Ven aquí ahora." But the man was already speaking to Luis, bending down to the child's level with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to talk to children. Rosa couldn't hear the words over the sound of her own heart pounding, but she could see Luis's face brightening with interest, the natural trust that made him so lovable also making him vulnerable. The other children seemed to sense the tension in the air. Tommy stepped closer to Luis, his young face uncertain but protective. Carmen moved toward the bench where her own older sister sat. The playground's cheerful noise began to fade as children picked up on the adult emotions swirling around them. Rosa reached Luis just as the man was extending his hand toward her brother. The man straightened, his smile never wavering. "Oh, I was just telling your little brother about my puppy," he said, his voice warm and reasonable. "I have a beautiful little dog at home, and I thought he might like to see it." "Thank you, but we can't," Rosa replied, taking Luis's hand and pulling him firmly toward her. "Come on, Luis. Mamai is waiting. But Luis was enchanted by the mention of a puppy. His face lit up with the special excitement that children reserve for small animals, and he looked up at the stranger with eager eyes. "What kind of puppy?" he asked, his voice breathless with wonder. "A golden retriever," the man replied, his attention entirely focused on Luis now. "Just a little thing, with fur so soft it feels like silk. He loves children, and he's been so lonely lately. I was thinking maybe you'd like to come see him, just for a few minutes." Rosa felt ice form in her veins. Every instinct she possessed was screaming danger, but Luis was already tugging against her grip, drawn by the promise of a puppy with the magnetic pull that such offers held for children. "No," Rosa said firmly, her voice carrying an authority beyond her years. "We're going home now." The man's smile faltered slightly, and for just a moment Rosa caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating beneath the friendly exterior. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but the brief glimpse was enough to confirm every fear that had been building in her chest. "Perhaps another time," the man said smoothly, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I understand a young lady needs to be careful. Very responsible of you." "It was nice meeting you, Luis," the man called out as they retreated. "Maybe I'll see you again soon." The use of her brother's name sent a shock through Rosa's system. She was certain she hadn't mentioned it, which meant the man had been listening to their conversation from a distance, learning details about them without their knowledge. The implications of that realization made her feel sick. "How did he know my name?" Luis asked as they hurried away from the playground, his voice puzzled but not yet alarmed. "I don't know," Rosa replied, her voice tight with controlled fear. "But we're going home right now." The walk home passed in a blur of racing thoughts and mounting anxiety. Rosa held Luis's hand so tightly that he complained, but she couldn't bring herself to loosen her grip. Every shadow seemed to hide threats. Every passing car made her tense with the expectation of seeing the stranger's face behind the wheel. "You're hurting my hand," Luis protested, trying to wriggle free. "I'm sorry," Rosa said, forcing herself to relax her grip slightly. "I just want to make sure you stay close." "Why can't we go see the puppy?" Luis asked, his disappointment clear in his voice. He seemed nice. Rosa struggled to find words that would explain the danger without terrifying her brother. How could she tell a 6-year-old that some adults couldn't be trusted? How could she explain the predatory gleam she had seen in the stranger's eyes without destroying Luis's innocent faith in the world? "Sometimes people who seem nice aren't really nice," she said carefully. "And Mamai and Papai taught us never to go anywhere with strangers, remember?" Luis nodded, but she could see he was still thinking about the promised puppy. The disappointment in his face made her heart ache, but it was better than the alternative. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had just escaped something terrible, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. When they reached home, Maria took one look at Rosa's face and knew something was wrong. "¿Qué pasó?" she asked in rapid Spanish, her mother's intuition immediately alert to danger. Rosa glanced at Luis, who was already heading toward his room to put away his jacket, then quickly told her mother about the encounter at the park. Maria's face grew increasingly grave as she listened, her hands unconsciously clenching into fists. "You did the right thing," Maria said when Rosa finished. "But I think maybe Luis doesn't go to the park for a while, see?" Rosa nodded, relief flooding through her at having the decision made by someone older and presumably wiser. But even as they spoke in hushed tones, she couldn't shake the image of the stranger's face or the way he had looked at Luis, like a man examining something he intended to purchase. That evening, the Albino family gathered for dinner as they always did, but the conversation seemed forced, punctuated by longer than usual silences. Antonio noticed the tension immediately, his dock worker's instincts attuned to danger in all its forms. "Everything all right?" he asked, looking between his wife and eldest daughter. Maria told him about the incident at the park, her voice low to keep Luis from overhearing. Antonio's expression darkened with each detail, his protective instincts fully aroused. "I should go to the police," he said when she finished. "And tell them what?" Maria replied wearily. "That a man talked to our children in a public park? They'll say he did nothing wrong." Antonio wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. The police in Oakland weren't particularly sympathetic to immigrant families, and without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, they would likely dismiss his concerns as paranoia. "Still," he said quietly, "we need to be more careful. No more park visits alone." The decision felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Luis loved the park with a passion that was beautiful to witness, and taking that away from him felt like stealing a piece of his childhood. But his safety was worth more than any amount of joy, and they all knew it. Luis himself seemed unaware of the undercurrents of tension that filled the house that evening. He played with his toys, helped Rosa with the dishes, and listened attentively as Antonio read him a story before bed. But Rosa noticed that he kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting to see something or someone outside. "What are you looking for?" she asked, as she tucked him into bed. "The man said maybe he'd see me again soon," Luis replied sleepily. "I was wondering if he might come by to show me the puppy." Rosa's blood turned to ice. "Luis, if you ever see that man again, you run and find a grown-up you know, okay? Don't talk to him. Don't listen to what he says. Just run." Luis nodded solemnly, though she could see he didn't fully understand the urgency behind her words. How could he? In his 6-year-old world, adults were protectors, not predators. The idea that someone might want to hurt him was as foreign as the concept of flying to the moon. Rosa lay awake long after the house had settled into sleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying the afternoon's events in her mind. Something about the encounter felt unfinished, as if it had been the first act of a play rather than a complete story. The man's parting words echoed in her memory. "Maybe I'll see you again soon." It had sounded like a promise. 3 days later, Luis Albino vanished without a trace. February 24th. The morning started like any other, with Maria moving through her kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness, and the familiar sounds of her family beginning another day. Luis appeared for breakfast with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about a dream he'd had involving dinosaurs and ice cream. Rosa walked him to school as she always did, holding his hand as they navigated the busy streets of Oakland. The routine was comforting in its predictability. After the unsettling encounter at the park, the family had fallen into a more protective pattern. Luis was no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised, and Rosa had been instructed to walk him directly to and from school with no detours or stops. Luis attended Sacred Heart Elementary School, a small Catholic institution that served the neighborhood's immigrant families. The building was old but well-maintained, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of golden light. The nuns who taught there were strict but kind, and they had a special fondness for Luis, whose sunny disposition and eager mind made him a favorite among students and teachers alike. "Adios, Rosa," Luis called as he ran toward the school's entrance, his lunch pail bouncing against his leg. "Ten cuidado," Rosa called after him. "Be careful." She watched until he disappeared through the school's heavy wooden doors, then turned to begin her own walk to the high school she attended across town. It was the last time she would see her brother for 70 years. The school day proceeded normally for Luis. He sat attentively through his classes, raised his hand eagerly to answer questions, and played enthusiastically during recess. His teacher, Sister Catherine, later recalled that he seemed in especially good spirits that day, excited about a art project they were working on, and full of questions about everything from arithmetic to angels. At lunch, Luis sat with his usual group of friends, sharing stories and trading portions of their meals with the casual generosity that characterized children from large families. He was animated and happy, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. The trouble began at dismissal time. Sacred Heart Elementary released its students at 3:15 p.m., with the children streaming out through the main entrance in a chaotic but supervised exodus. Rosa arrived at 3:10, positioning herself at the usual meeting spot where she could easily spot Luis among the crowd of children. 3:15 came and went. The stream of children slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Rosa scanned the remaining faces anxiously, looking for the familiar sight of her brother's dark hair and bright smile. By 3:30, the schoolyard was nearly empty except for a few children waiting for late parents and Rosa, who was beginning to feel the first stirrings of real panic. She approached Sister Catherine, who was supervising the last few departing students. "Excuse me, sister," Rosa said, her voice carefully controlled. "I'm looking for my brother, Luis Albino. He's in first grade." Sister Catherine's face immediately creased with concern. "Luis? But he left already, dear. I saw him walk out with the other children right at dismissal time." Rosa's world tilted slightly. "Are you sure? I've been waiting here the whole time, and I didn't see him." "Let me check with Sister Margaret," Sister Catherine said, her own anxiety beginning to show. She was supervising the front door today. The next few minutes passed in a blur of increasingly frantic conversations with school personnel. Sister Margaret confirmed that she had seen Luis leave the building, but couldn't remember specifically whether he had left alone or with someone. The children's exodus was always chaotic, and it was impossible to track every individual departure. By 4:00 p.m., the school's principal, Mother Superior Agnes, had been summoned. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of childhood crisis imaginable. But even her considerable composure was shaken by the situation unfolding in her school. "We need to contact your parents immediately," she told Rosa, who was now openly weeping with terror and guilt. "They're at work," Rosa managed through her tears. "Papa is at the docks, and Maman is at home sewing. Oh God, what am I going to tell them?" Mother Superior Agnes placed a gentle but firm hand on Rosa's shoulder. "First, we're going to search every inch of this school to make absolutely certain Luis isn't hiding somewhere. Then we're going to call the police." The search of the school was thorough and systematic, but it yielded nothing. Luis Albino had simply vanished somewhere between the classroom and the street, disappeared as completely as if he had never existed at all. The call to the Oakland Police Department was made at 4:30 p.m. Officer Michael Sullivan arrived at the school 20 minutes later, a gruff Irish-American cop in his 40s, who had seen enough missing children cases to know that the first few hours were critical. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, his notepad ready as he settled into the principal's office with Rosa and Mother Superior Agnes. Rosa recounted the day's events through tears, her voice breaking as she described the normal routine that had somehow led to this nightmare. She mentioned the incident at the park 3 days earlier, and Sullivan's expression sharpened with interest. "This man at the park," he said. "Can you describe him?" Rosa provided every detail she could remember, from the stranger's expensive clothes to the calculating look in his eyes. Sullivan wrote it all down, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Did anyone else see this interaction?" he asked. "Other children were around, but I don't think any adults saw him specifically," Rosa replied. "He was very careful about positioning himself away from other grown-ups." Sullivan nodded grimly. In his experience, that kind of calculated behavior was never accidental. By 5:00 p.m., the search had expanded beyond the school grounds. Police officers were canvassing the neighborhood, showing Luis's school photograph to shopkeepers and residents, asking if anyone had seen a 6-year-old boy walking alone or with an adult. Antonio arrived at the school at 5:30, having been pulled from his shift at the docks by a message that had taken 20 minutes to reach him through the complex hierarchy of foremen and supervisors. His face was white with terror, his work clothes still grimy with the day's labor. "Where is my son?" he demanded in heavily accented English, his voice carrying the full weight of a father's anguish. The scene that followed would be seared into Rosa's memory forever. Antonio's initial anger at the school, at the police, at Rosa herself for failing to protect Luis, gave way to a grief so profound it seemed to fill the small office like a physical presence. Marie arrived 30 minutes later, having run the entire distance from their house, and her keening wails when she learned what had happened brought tears to the eyes of hardened police officers. The official search began in earnest as darkness fell over Oakland. Police cars prowled the streets with searchlights, their beams cutting through the evening fog that rolled in from the bay. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined the effort, calling Luis's name into the growing darkness, checking every alley and doorway where a frightened child might hide. But even as the search expanded, Officer Sullivan was developing a theory that made his stomach clench with dread. The mysterious man at the park, the careful way he had approached Luis, the timing of the boy's disappearance, it all pointed to something far worse than a child who had simply wandered off. "I think we're dealing with an abduction," he told his sergeant in a quiet conversation away from the family. The park incident was probably reconnaissance. Someone was watching this kid, learning his routines. The sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Patrick Murphy, nodded grimly. "Any leads on the suspect?" "Working on it. The sister gave us a good description, and we're checking with other families in the area to see if anyone else has reported suspicious approaches. But if this guy is smart and the planning suggests he is, he's probably long gone by now." As the search continued through the night, the Albino family maintained a vigil at the school, refusing to leave the last place where Luis had been seen. Maria clutched his empty lunch pail to her chest, whispering prayers in Portuguese and Spanish. Antonio stood by the window, staring out into the darkness as if he could will his son to appear through sheer force of love. Rosa sat in a corner of the principal's office, replaying every moment of the past week in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed, signs she should have recognized. The guilt was crushing. She was supposed to protect Luis, and she had failed in the most fundamental way possible. But it was Officer Sullivan who voiced the thought that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say aloud. "The first 72 hours are critical in cases like this," he told the family gently. "If we don't find Luis by then—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As dawn broke over Oakland on February 25, 1951, Luis Albino had been missing for 18 hours. The massive search effort had yielded no trace of the boy. No witnesses, no evidence, no sign that he had ever existed at all. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. But somewhere in the city, in a location that would remain hidden for 7 decades, a 6-year-old boy was beginning the first day of a new life, one that would be built on lies, maintained by manipulation, and hidden from the world by the careful planning of a man who had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The truth about what happened to Luis Albino would remain buried for 70 years, hidden beneath layers of deception so carefully constructed that even the boy himself would eventually forget who he had once been. Until one day in 2021, when an elderly man would begin asking questions that would unravel one of California's most enduring mysteries, and reveal a story so shocking that those who heard it could barely believe it was real. February 24, 1951, 3:25 p.m., Oakland, California. The black Buick idled at the corner of 14th and Castro Streets, its engine purring with the quiet confidence of expensive machinery. Behind the wheel sat Roger Clifton, a man whose outward respectability masked depths of calculated malevolence that would have horrified anyone who glimpsed them. His manicured hands gripped the steering wheel as he watched the stream of children emerging from Sacred Heart Elementary School, his pale eyes scanning each small face with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. Clifton was 42 years old, a successful insurance adjuster, who lived alone in a meticulously maintained house in the Berkeley Hills. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, well-dressed bachelor who kept to himself but was always polite when encountered on the street. To his colleagues, he was a thorough professional who handled even the most complex claims with methodical precision. None of them suspected that Roger Clifton harbored desires that would destroy lives and shatter families. He had been planning this moment for weeks, ever since that day at the park when he had first seen Luis Albino. The boy had captivated him immediately. Not just his physical beauty, though that was undeniable, but something deeper. There was an innocence about Luis that seemed to glow from within, a trusting nature that made Clifton's pulse quicken with anticipation. This child would be perfect for what he had in mind. The planning had been meticulous. Clifton had studied the school's routines, noting the chaos of dismissal time when dozens of children poured onto the sidewalk in a confusion of voices and movement. He had observed the casual supervision, the way teachers focused on keeping children from running into traffic rather than monitoring who they left with. Most importantly, he had identified the brief window of opportunity that occurred every day at 3. Now, as he watched Luis emerge from the school building, Clifton felt his heart rate accelerate. The boy looked even more beautiful than he remembered, his dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight, his face bright with the innocent happiness that had first attracted Clifton's attention. Luis was walking with a group of other children, but as they reached the sidewalk, he naturally separated from the crowd, heading toward the corner where his sister usually waited. But today, Rosa was positioned differently than usual. A minor construction project had forced her to wait on the opposite side of the street, and Clifton had been counting on exactly this kind of small disruption to create the opening he needed. Luis reached the corner and looked around, confused by his sister's absence from their usual meeting spot. Clifton could see the boy's uncertainty as he stood alone, his small figure dwarfed by the urban landscape around him. It was time. Clifton stepped out of his car with practiced casualness, straightening his expensive coat and settling his hat at the precise angle that suggested respectability without ostentation. He had spent considerable time crafting his appearance for this moment, well dressed enough to inspire trust, but not so formal as to seem out of place in a working-class neighborhood. "Luis," he called out, his voice warm with feigned recognition. "There you are." The boy turned at the sound of his name, his face lighting up as he recognized the man who had promised him a puppy. Clifton felt a surge of satisfaction at how perfectly his psychological manipulation was working. Children, he had learned, were remarkably easy to deceive once you understood their basic needs and desires. "Hi," Luis said brightly, walking toward Clifton with the trusting enthusiasm that made him such an ideal target. "Did you bring your puppy?" "Not today," Clifton replied, bending down to Luis's eye level with the practiced ease of someone who had spent considerable time studying how to interact with children. "But I have an even better surprise. Your mother asked me to pick you up today. She's waiting for us at my house, where the puppy is." Luis's face scrunched with confusion. "Mamai is at my house," he said uncertainly. "She's always home when I get back from school." Clifton had anticipated this objection. "She had to run an important errand today," he explained smoothly. "Something about your father's work at the docks. She asked me to collect you because she knew how much you wanted to see the puppy." The lie was delivered with such conviction that even an adult might have been momentarily convinced. Luis, with his 6-year-old's limited understanding of adult complexities, found the explanation plausible enough to override his initial confusion. "Really?" he asked, his excitement building. "The puppy is at your house?" "A beautiful golden retriever, just like I told you," Clifton confirmed. "He's been waiting to meet you. Would you like to come see him?" Luis nodded eagerly, any remaining hesitation evaporating in the face of his desire to see the promised puppy. Clifton took his small hand with gentle firmness, noting how perfectly it fit within his own larger grasp. "My car is right here," Clifton said, leading Luis toward the black Buick. "We'll be at my house in just a few minutes." As they walked to the car, Luis chattered excitedly about his day at school, unaware that he was crossing an invisible threshold from which there would be no return. Clifton listened with feigned interest, making appropriate responses while his mind raced through the final details of his plan. The car door closed with the solid thunk of quality engineering, sealing Luis inside what would become his prison. Clifton slid behind the wheel and started the engine, his movements calm and deliberate despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "How far is your house?" Louis asked, peering out the window as they pulled away from the curb. "Not far at all," Clifton replied. "Just far enough to be a nice adventure." As they drove through Oakland's afternoon traffic, Louis maintained his cheerful chatter, pointing out things that caught his attention and asking endless questions about the puppy he believed he was going to meet. Clifton answered mechanically, his attention focused on navigating the route he had memorized weeks earlier, a path that avoided major thoroughfares and potential witnesses while leading inexorably toward his prepared destination. They crossed the Bay Bridge as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the San Francisco skyline glittering like a jeweled crown in the distance. Louis pressed his face to the window, marveling at the view, unaware that he was leaving behind everything and everyone he had ever known. "Wow," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "I've never been this high up before." "There are lots of things you've never seen before," Clifton said, and there was something in his tone that might have alarmed an older child. But Louis was too enchanted by the view to notice the subtle shift in his captor's demeanor. The drive continued north through Berkeley and into the hills, where expensive houses nestled among eucalyptus groves and commanded sweeping views of the bay below. This was a different world from the modest neighborhoods of Oakland, a realm of privilege and privacy that offered exactly the isolation Clifton required for what he planned to do. His house stood at the end of a winding private road, screened from neighbors by carefully maintained landscaping and natural terrain. It was a substantial structure built in the craftsman style, with dark wood siding and deep eaves that created pools of shadow even in daylight. The windows were tall and narrow, like eyes that watched without revealing what lay behind them. "This is a big house," Louis observed as they pulled into the driveway. "I live alone, so I have plenty of room," Clifton replied. "You'll like it here." The words carried an implication that Louis was too young to understand, but they sent a chill through the evening air that seemed to penetrate the car's warm interior. Clifton turned off the engine and sat for a moment, savoring the completion of the first phase of his plan. Louis was already reaching for the door handle, eager to get out and find the promised puppy. Clifton placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "Before we go inside, there are some rules you need to understand," he said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority. "This is a special place, and special places have special rules." Louis nodded seriously, ready to agree to anything if it meant seeing the puppy. "First," Clifton continued, "no one else knows about this place or about the puppy. It's our secret, just between you and me. If you tell anyone about it, bad things might happen to your family." The boy's eyes widened with concern. "What kind of bad things?" "The kind of bad things that happen when children don't follow rules," Clifton replied ominously. "But you're a good boy, aren't you? You follow rules." Louis nodded quickly, his earlier excitement now tempered by a growing sense of unease. Something in the man's tone was different from before, harder, less friendly. "Second," Clifton continued, "while you're here, you'll need to call me Uncle Roger. Can you remember that?" "Uncle Roger," Louis repeated obediently. "Very good. And third," Clifton paused, studying the child's face with calculating eyes. "While you're here, your name isn't Louis anymore. That's the old name for your old life. Your new name is Johnny. Can you say that for me?" Louis, now Johnny, hesitated, confusion evident in his young face. "But my name is Louis," he said uncertainly. "Not anymore," Clifton replied firmly. "That was your name when you lived with those other people, but now you live with Uncle Roger, and Uncle Roger says your name is Johnny. Do you understand?" The boy nodded slowly, though his confusion was deepening. The adult world often made little sense to 6-year-olds, filled as it was with arbitrary rules and inexplicable changes. If Uncle Roger said his name was Johnny now, then perhaps that was simply how things worked. "Good boy, Johnny," Clifton said, emphasizing the new name. "Now let's go inside and find that puppy." But there was no puppy. The house's interior was as meticulously maintained as its exterior, decorated in dark wood and muted colors that suggested masculine taste and substantial income. The rooms were spacious but somehow oppressive, filled with heavy furniture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Photographs lined the mantelpiece and side tables, but they were all of strangers, family members Clifton had never had, friends he had never made, a life he had never lived. Johnny looked around expectantly, waiting for the promised golden retriever to appear. When no dog materialized, he turned to Clifton with questioning eyes. "Where's the puppy?" he asked. "The puppy is sleeping right now," Clifton replied smoothly. "We'll see him later. First, let me show you your room." He led the boy up a staircase that creaked softly under their weight, past bedrooms that were closed off and unused, to a smaller room at the end of the hall. It had clearly been prepared in advance. Child-sized furniture, toys arranged on shelves, clothes in the closet that would fit a 6-year-old boy. But there was something unsettling about the room's perfection, as if it were a stage set rather than a living space. "This is where you'll sleep," Clifton announced. "Do you like it?" Johnny nodded politely, though his enthusiasm was continuing to diminish. The room was nice enough, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a place where someone else lived, someone who happened to be his size. "I want to see the puppy now," he said with the insistence that children use when adults fail to deliver on promises. "Soon," Clifton replied. "But first you need to understand how things work here. Sit down." Johnny perched on the edge of the small bed, his legs swinging freely as he looked up at the man who had become his captor. Clifton pulled up a chair and sat facing him, his expression serious and intent. "Johnny," he began, using the new name with deliberate emphasis, "the people you used to live with aren't your real family. They were just taking care of you for a while, but now it's time for you to live with your real family, with me." The boy's face scrunched with confusion. "But Mama and Papa are my real family," he protested, "and Rosa and Miguel and João." "No," Clifton said firmly. "Those people lied to you. I'm your real uncle, and this is your real home. The other place was just temporary." It was a lie so audacious that it might have seemed impossible to maintain. But Clifton had studied the psychology of children extensively. He understood that young minds were remarkably adaptable, capable of accepting new realities when presented with sufficient authority and repetition. The key was to isolate the child from conflicting information while steadily reinforcing the new narrative. Johnny's lower lip began to tremble. "I want to go home," he said, his voice small and uncertain. "This is your home now," Clifton replied without a trace of sympathy. "And if you're a good boy and follow the rules, you'll be very happy here. But if you're not a good boy..." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but clearly understood. Johnny's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded his understanding. "That's my boy," Clifton said, his voice softening with false warmth. "Now, are you hungry? I have dinner ready downstairs." The meal that followed was a surreal exercise in forced normalcy. Clifton had prepared a child-friendly dinner, chicken nuggets, mashed potatoes, green beans, and he served it on plates, decorated with cartoon characters. He maintained a steady stream of cheerful conversation, asking about Johnny's favorite foods and colors and games, as if they were simply getting to know each other rather than captor and victim. Johnny picked at his food, his appetite diminished by homesickness and confusion. Every few minutes, he would ask about going home or seeing his family, and each time Clifton would patiently correct him, reminding him that this was his home now, that he was with his real family. "Can I call Mama and Maya?" Johnny asked as they finished eating. "There's no phone here," Clifton lied smoothly. "But don't worry about those people anymore. They're not thinking about you." It was a cruel assertion, designed to undermine the child's sense of being loved and wanted, part of the systematic psychological manipulation that would gradually erode his connection to his former life. Johnny's face crumpled at the words, tears spilling down his cheeks. "They are thinking about me," he protested. "They love me. If they loved you, why did they let you come with me?" Clifton asked with devastating logic. "If they really cared, Wouldn't they have stopped you from leaving? The question was unanswerable for a 6-year-old mind, creating exactly the kind of cognitive dissonance that Clifton was counting on to break down Johnny's resistance to his new reality. As the evening progressed, Clifton established the routines that would govern Johnny's new life. Bath time, story time, bedtime, all the normal rituals of childhood, but twisted into tools of control and indoctrination. The stories he read were carefully chosen to reinforce themes of family loyalty and the dangers of talking to strangers. The bath was supervised with an intimacy that made Johnny uncomfortable, though he lacked the vocabulary to express his unease. When Johnny was finally tucked into the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by toys that belonged to some other child's life, he began to cry in earnest. "I want to go home," he sobbed. "I want Mama." Clifton sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder with possessive weight. "This is your home now, Johnny," he said quietly, "and I'm your family. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." "But where's the puppy?" Johnny asked through his tears, clinging to the one promise that might still be honored. "Maybe tomorrow," Clifton replied, "if you're a very good boy." But tomorrow came and went without a puppy, as did the day after that, and the day after that. Each time Johnny asked, Clifton would deflect with another excuse, another condition that needed to be met first. Gradually, the boy stopped asking. Just as he gradually stopped asking about his family, his real name, his former life. The transformation was not immediate, but it was inexorable. Day by day, week by week, Clifton systematically erased Luis Albino and replaced him with Johnny Clifton. He enrolled the boy in a private school using forged documents that listed him as a nephew who had come to live with his uncle following a family tragedy. The story was plausible enough to satisfy bureaucratic requirements, and Johnny's natural intelligence and charm quickly won over teachers who had no reason to suspect anything amiss. Clifton moved carefully to avoid detection. He had spent months researching missing children cases, studying the patterns of investigation and the statistical likelihood of discovery. He knew that most searches focused on the immediate area surrounding the disappearance, and that the probability of finding a missing child dropped dramatically after the first 72 hours. By taking Johnny across state lines and into a completely different social environment, he had dramatically reduced the chances of accidental discovery. More importantly, he understood the psychological vulnerabilities of children. Johnny's memories of his former life were not simply suppressed. They were actively rewritten through a combination of gaslighting, isolation, and the gradual introduction of false memories. Clifton would show him photographs of himself as a baby, carefully fabricated to support the fiction that they were related. He would tell stories about Johnny's real parents, tragic figures who had died in an accident and left their son in his care. The process was helped by Johnny's natural resilience and adaptability. Children are remarkably good at surviving in adverse circumstances by accepting whatever reality they are presented with. When the adult world insists that something is true, children generally lack the resources to question that assertion effectively. By the end of 1951, Luis Albino had effectively ceased to exist. In his place was Johnny Clifton, a bright, well-behaved boy who lived with his uncle in the Berkeley Hills and attended Hillside Academy, an exclusive private school that catered to the children of wealthy families. To all outward appearances, he was simply another privileged child enjoying the benefits of affluent California life. But beneath the surface, the trauma of his abduction had left scars that would never fully heal. Johnny suffered from nightmares he couldn't explain, flashes of memory that felt like scenes from someone else's life. Sometimes he would catch himself listening for voices that never came, or looking for faces he couldn't quite remember. Clifton dismissed these episodes as childhood imagination, but they were actually fragments of Lewis's buried identity struggling to surface. By the time Johnny turned 10, the transformation was complete. He had no conscious memory of ever being anyone other than Johnny Clifton, no recollection of a family named Albino or a life in Oakland. The few fragments that occasionally surfaced were easily dismissed as dreams or fantasies, dismissed by an adult who claimed to know better. Clifton had proven to be a master manipulator, using a combination of isolation, gaslighting, and carefully calibrated affection to maintain control over his victim. Johnny was allowed certain freedoms. He attended school, participated in extracurricular activities, even had carefully supervised friendships, but always within the rigid boundaries that Clifton established. The relationship between them was complex and deeply disturbing. Clifton had not simply abducted a child for immediate gratification. He had created a long-term situation that satisfied his need for control and companionship while maintaining the facade of respectability that allowed him to function in society. Johnny was simultaneously son, prisoner, and project, a living testament to Clifton's ability to reshape reality according to his desires. To the outside world, they appeared to be a loving uncle and nephew navigating life together after family tragedy. Clifton played the role of devoted guardian with consummate skill, attending school events, meeting with teachers, even participating in community activities that reinforced his image as a respectable single man, raising his orphaned nephew. Johnny, for his part, had learned to navigate the complex emotional landscape of his situation with the survival instincts that children develop in abusive environments. He understood intuitively that his safety depended on maintaining Clifton's approval, and he had become skilled at reading the subtle signs that indicated his guardian's mood and expectations. The abuse, for that was what it was, even if it didn't always involve physical violence, was psychological rather than overtly sexual, though there were elements of inappropriate intimacy that Johnny had learned not to question. Clifton's need for control manifested in countless small ways, monitoring Johnny's friendships, reading his mail, dictating his activities, maintaining the kind of surveillance that would have been recognized as pathological if it had been visible to outside observers. But it wasn't visible. Clifton was too careful, too skilled at presenting exactly the image that would satisfy casual scrutiny. When teachers occasionally noticed that Johnny seemed withdrawn or overly compliant, Clifton would explain it as the natural result of early trauma and loss. When neighbors commented on how quiet the house was, he would describe himself as a private person who valued peace and solitude. Johnny's academic performance was excellent, partly due to his natural intelligence, but also because Clifton demanded nothing less than perfection in all areas of his life. Failure was not tolerated, mistakes were not forgiven, and disappointment was met with punishments that were subtle but effective. Johnny learned to anticipate problems before they occurred, to excel not because he loved learning, but because anything less than excellence carried consequences he had learned to fear. As he entered adolescence, Johnny began to experience the normal stirrings of independence that characterize teenage development. But these natural impulses collided with Clifton's need for absolute control, creating tensions that neither of them was equipped to resolve in healthy ways. "I want to try out for the baseball team," Johnny announced one evening at dinner, his voice carefully casual. Clifton looked up from his meal, his expression neutral but his eyes calculating. "Baseball takes a lot of time," he said. "Time away from home, time away from your studies." "I could keep my grades up," Johnny insisted. "And lots of other guys play sports." "Other guys don't have your responsibilities," Clifton replied. "Other guys don't understand how special our relationship is." The words were delivered with the kind of emotional weight that Johnny had learned to recognize as a warning. Clifton was not simply expressing an opinion. He was establishing a boundary that crossing would carry consequences. "I just thought it might be fun," Johnny said quietly, his enthusiasm already deflating. "Fun," Clifton repeated, as if the word itself was suspect. "There are lots of ways to have fun that don't involve running around with boys who don't understand you the way I do." The conversation was over, the decision made without ever being explicitly stated. Johnny would not be trying out for the baseball team, just as he would not be attending sleepovers, joining clubs, or pursuing any activity that might create connections beyond Clifton's control. By the time Johnny reached 16, the psychological prison that Clifton had constructed was beginning to show cracks. Adolescence brought with it a natural questioning of authority that even the most sophisticated manipulation couldn't entirely suppress. Johnny found himself wondering about things he had never questioned before. Why he had no extended family, why there were no photographs of him before age 6, why certain topics were always deflected or avoided. The questions created a cognitive dissonance that Clifton worked frantically to resolve through intensified control and surveillance. Johnny's activities were monitored even more closely, his social interactions scrutinized for signs of dangerous influence. The house in the Berkeley Hills became less a home and more a fortress designed to keep the outside world at bay. But the outside world had a way of intruding, despite Clifton's best efforts. Johnny's growing awareness of normal family dynamics, gleaned from interactions with classmates and their parents, made him increasingly conscious of how different his own situation was. Other teenagers complained about their parents' rules, but their complaints carried an undertone of affection and security that was completely absent from Johnny's relationship with his guardian. "Why don't we ever visit any relatives?" Johnny asked one evening, the question emerging from weeks of building curiosity. Clifton's hands stilled on his newspaper, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "You know we don't have any other family," he replied. "It's just us." "But everyone has some family," Johnny persisted. "Grandparents, cousins, someone." "Not everyone," Clifton said firmly. "Some families are just smaller." The answer felt insufficient, like so many of Clifton's explanations when pressed for details about their shared history. Johnny had learned not to push too hard. Experience had taught him that excessive curiosity was met with emotional withdrawal that felt like a form of punishment. But the questions continued to multiply in his mind. That night, alone in his room, Johnny found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror and trying to find traces of family resemblance between himself and the man who claimed to be his uncle. The exercise left him feeling unsettled in ways he couldn't articulate, as if he were looking at a stranger wearing his face. The nightmares that had plagued his childhood returned with increased frequency and intensity. Dreams of unfamiliar faces calling his name, of a woman with dark hair who sang to him in a language he didn't recognize, of children who looked like they might be siblings. He would wake from these dreams with his heart pounding and a sense of loss so profound it felt like grief. When he mentioned the dreams to Clifton, his guardian's reaction was swift and decisive. "Those aren't memories," Clifton said firmly. "They're just your mind processing the trauma of losing your parents. It's normal for orphans to create fantasy families to cope with their loss." The explanation was delivered with such authority that Johnny almost believed it. Almost. But something deep inside him, some core part of his identity that had never been fully extinguished, whispered that the dreams felt more like memories than fantasies. Johnny's first attempt to leave came during his senior year of high school. It wasn't a dramatic rebellion or a calculated plan for freedom. It was simply an 18-year-old's natural desire to attend college away from home, to experience the independence that his classmates took for granted. "I've been accepted to UC Berkeley," he announced over dinner one evening in the spring of 1965. "Full scholarship." Clifton's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Berkeley," he repeated slowly. "It's a great school," Johnny continued, his enthusiasm building despite the warning signs he could see in his guardian's posture. "And it's close enough that I could come home on weekends if you wanted." "You're not going to Berkeley," Clifton said quietly. "But it's a full scholarship," Johnny protested, "and I've already been accepted." "You're not going anywhere," Clifton replied, his voice carrying the kind of finality that Johnny had learned to recognize as non-negotiable. The argument that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in their household before. Johnny, emboldened by approaching adulthood and years of suppressed frustration, pushed back with an intensity that clearly shocked his guardian. But Clifton's response was swift and devastating. Not physical violence, but a psychological assault that left Johnny feeling utterly isolated and dependent. "You think you can just leave?" Clifton asked, his voice cold with controlled fury. You think you can walk away from the only person who has ever truly cared about you? Do you have any idea what the world is like for people like us? The phrase "people like us" carried implications that Johnny had never been encouraged to examine. But in that moment he began to understand that his guardian's attachment to him was not simply familial. It was possessive in ways that normal families never were. "I just want to go to college," Johnny said weakly. "What you want doesn't matter," Clifton replied. "What matters is what's best for you, and I'm the only one who knows what that is." In the end, Johnny didn't go to Berkeley. The scholarship offer was declined, the acceptance withdrawn. The future Johnny had imagined dissolved like smoke. He spent the summer of 1965 working at a local bookstore, living at home, watching his former classmates prepare for lives that seemed forever beyond his reach. But something had changed during that confrontation. A seed of resistance had been planted that would eventually grow into the determination to discover the truth about his identity, no matter how deeply it had been buried. By the time Johnny reached his mid-20s, the psychological cage that had contained him for nearly 2 decades was finally beginning to crack beyond repair. Clifton, now in his 60s, was less physically imposing than he had been during Johnny's childhood, and the techniques that had worked to control a frightened 6-year-old were proving inadequate to contain a grown man's growing suspicions. The breaking point came on a rainy evening in November 1970. Johnny had been living at home for 25 years, working at various jobs, but never quite achieving the independence that his peers took for granted. Every attempt to establish a life beyond Clifton's control had been systematically undermined through a combination of emotional manipulation and practical sabotage. On this particular evening, Johnny was cleaning out a storage closet when he discovered a box that had been hidden behind old coats and forgotten belongings. Inside were documents that would change everything: newspaper clippings about a missing child named Luis Albino, photographs of a family he dimly recognized, and a birth certificate that bore his face but a different name. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. He sat on the floor of the closet, surrounded by the debris of his stolen life, and felt 25 years of carefully constructed identity crumble around him. Luis Albino. The name resonated in ways that Johnny Clifton never had, awakening memories that had been buried so deep he had forgotten they existed. Suddenly the nightmares made sense. The dreams of unfamiliar faces calling his name. They weren't fantasies. They were fragments of his real life struggling to surface despite decades of systematic suppression. When Clifton found him there an hour later, still sitting among the scattered evidence of his crimes, the old man's facade finally cracked completely. "You weren't supposed to find those," Clifton said quietly, his voice carrying neither surprise nor remorse. "My name is Luis," Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My real name is Luis Albino." "Your name is whatever I say it is," Clifton replied, but the words carried less conviction than they once had. "Those people are gone now. They stopped looking for you decades ago." "They were my family," Luis said, the name feeling strange and familiar on his tongue simultaneously. "I'm your family," Clifton insisted. "I'm the one who raised you, who cared for you, who gave you everything you needed." "You stole me," Luis replied, and with those words, the last vestiges of Johnny Clifton began to dissolve. The confrontation that followed was 25 years in the making. All the suppressed rage, all the buried questions, all the stolen possibilities erupted in a torrent of accusation and denial that shook the foundations of the house in the Berkeley Hills. But even as Luis reclaimed his identity, he faced a devastating reality. The family he remembered from fragments and dreams might no longer exist. 25 years was a lifetime, long enough for people to die, to move away, to give up hope. The boy who had been taken from Oakland in 1951 was gone forever, replaced by a man who bore the scars of an unimaginable crime. Luis Albino, for that was who he truly was, regardless of the name he had been forced to use, finally escaped the Berkeley Hills house in 1972 at the age of 27. By then, Clifton was ill with emphysema, his control weakening along with his health. The departure was not dramatic. No police involvement, no public revelation of the decades-long crime. Luis simply packed his few belongings and walked away from the only home he consciously remembered. But freedom, when it finally came, was more complicated than he had imagined. He had no social security number that matched his real name, no birth certificate that would stand up to scrutiny, no legal identity that connected him to the family he had been stolen from. Johnny Clifton existed on paper. Luis Albino was a ghost. The search for his real family began tentatively, hampered by his own fragmented memories and the passage of so much time. The Oakland he remembered from childhood had changed dramatically in 25 years, and many of the landmarks of his early life had been demolished or transformed beyond recognition. He found his childhood address first, the house on 7th Street, where he had lived for the first 6 years of his life. It was smaller than he remembered, shabbier, occupied by strangers who knew nothing of the family that had once called it home. Standing on the sidewalk where he had last walked with Rosa, Luis felt the full weight of everything he had lost. The Albino family had scattered in the years following his disappearance. His parents, he learned through careful research, had died in the 1960s, his father of a heart attack, his mother of cancer. Both had gone to their graves believing their youngest son was dead, never knowing that he was alive and searching for them from across an impossible divide. Rosa had married and moved to Los Angeles, where she worked as a nurse and raised 3 children of her own. His brothers Miguel and João had enlisted in the military and eventually settled in different states, carrying with them the shared trauma of a family destroyed by an unspeakable crime. Luis found Rosa first, in 1975. The reunion was devastating and wonderful in equal measure. A middle-aged woman opening her door to find a man whose face still carried traces of the little brother she had lost, whose eyes still held the gentleness that had made him so beloved and so vulnerable. "Luis," she whispered, her hand rising to her throat in shock. "Oh my God, Luis." "I'm home," he said simply, and they both began to weep. The story that emerged over the following days and weeks was almost impossible to believe. Rosa had blamed herself for Luis's disappearance for 35 years, convinced that she had failed in her duty to protect him. Learning that he had been alive all this time, that he had grown up believing he was someone else, that he had spent decades trying to find his way back to them. It was simultaneously the answer to a lifetime of prayers and the confirmation of their worst fears about what had happened to him. But there were complications that made the reunion bittersweet. Luis had been shaped by his experience in ways that couldn't be undone. The trauma of his abduction and the decades of psychological manipulation had left him with trust issues, relationship difficulties, and a profound sense of displacement that would never fully heal. Moreover, he faced the practical challenge of reclaiming an identity that had been legally erased. Johnny Clifton had a work history, credit rating, and paper trail that Luis Albino lacked. The bureaucratic process of proving who he really was, of convincing government agencies that a man who had been missing for 25 years was really the same person as a 6-year-old who had vanished from Oakland, was labyrinthine and often humiliating. By 1980, Luis had successfully established legal proof of his identity and reconnected with his surviving siblings. But the question of what to do about Roger Clifton remained unresolved. The man who had stolen his childhood was still alive, still living in the Berkeley Hills house, still maintaining the fiction that he had been a loving guardian rather than a calculating predator. Luis wrestled with the decision for months. Pressing charges would mean reliving the trauma publicly, exposing details of his captivity that he had shared with no one except his closest family members. It would mean testifying about psychological abuse that was difficult to prove, and even more difficult to explain to people who had never experienced such systematic manipulation. Moreover, the legal landscape for cases involving historic child abduction was murky. The statute of limitations had long since expired for many of the potential charges, and proving intent in a case where the victim had been raised rather than immediately harmed presented unique challenges for prosecutors. In the end, Luis chose a different path. Rather than seeking legal justice, he confronted Clifton directly one final time, returning to the Berkeley Hills house where he had spent most of his life. The man who answered the door was a shadow of the imposing figure who had once controlled every aspect of Luis's existence. Clifton was in his 70s now, frail and clearly ill, his face showing the ravages of emphysema and age. "Hello, Roger," Luis said quietly. Clifton studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside to let him enter. They sat in the living room where Luis had spent countless evenings as a child, surrounded by the artifacts of a life built on lies. "I know who I am now," Luis said. "I know what you did." Clifton was silent for a long time, his breathing labored and shallow. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I gave you a good life," he said. "I educated you, cared for you, loved you in my own way." "You stole me," Luis replied. "You stole my childhood, my family, my identity. You stole everything." "I saved you," Clifton insisted, but the words carried no conviction. "That family couldn't have given you what I gave you." Luis looked around the room, seeing it now through adult eyes unclouded by fear or dependency. It was a beautiful house, expensively furnished and meticulously maintained, but it was also a prison, a place where a child's soul had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to one man's twisted desires. "You didn't save me," Luis said finally. "You broke me, and it's taken me 30 years to put myself back together." Clifton died 3 months later, taking his secrets with him to the grave. There was no public revelation of his crimes, no newspaper headlines about the child he had stolen and the life he had destroyed. To the world, he remained Roger Clifton, successful insurance adjuster and respected member of the Berkeley community. But Luis knew the truth, and that knowledge was enough. Luis Albino spent the rest of his life trying to heal from wounds that could never fully close. He married, though not until his 40s, and the relationship was marked by the trust issues and emotional distance that were the inevitable legacy of his stolen childhood. He worked as a carpenter, finding peace in the act of building things with his hands, creating structures that were solid and permanent in ways that his own foundation had never been. His relationship with his surviving siblings remained complicated. They loved each other fiercely, but they were also strangers who had lived entirely different lives since childhood. The Luis they remembered was frozen in time at age 6, while the man who returned to them carried the accumulated weight of decades spent in psychological captivity. Rosa, in particular, struggled with guilt that never entirely faded. She had been 15 when Luis vanished, given responsibility for his safety that no teenager should have had to bear. Learning that he had been alive all those years, that she might have been able to save him if she had somehow done something differently, was almost more difficult to process than his death would have been. The family gathered regularly for holidays and special occasions, but there was always an undertone of loss that colored even their happiest moments. They were incomplete, marked by an absence that could never be filled despite Luis's return. The little boy who had vanished from Oakland in 1951 was gone forever, replaced by a man who carried his memories but could never reclaim his stolen innocence. Luis never had children of his own. The idea of bringing a child into a world where such things could happen seemed impossible to him, too fraught with dangers he understood better than most people ever would. He became instead a devoted uncle to Rosa's children and grandchildren, showering them with the protective love he had been denied. As he aged, Luis began to suffer from symptoms that doctors eventually diagnosed as complex PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, sudden moments of panic that seemed to come from nowhere. The trauma of his abduction and captivity had left neurological scars that would never fully heal, echoes of a childhood spent in constant psychological tension. But he also found peace in unexpected places. Working with his hands gave him a sense of control that had been denied to him for so many years. The simple act of measuring wood, cutting joints, building something that would last, it became a form of meditation that helped quiet the voices of doubt and fear that Clifton had planted so deeply in his psyche. And slowly, over the decades, He began to remember more about his early childhood. The memories came in fragments. His mother's voice singing Portuguese lullabies, the smell of his father's cologne, the feel of Rosa's hand in his as they walked to the park. Each recovered memory was precious, a small piece of his stolen identity restored. As Luis entered his 70s, he began to think more seriously about legacy, not just his own, but the story of what had happened to him and what it meant for other families dealing with missing children. The world had changed dramatically since 1951, with missing children's cases receiving far more attention and resources than they had in his childhood. But the fundamental dynamics remained the same: predators who exploited society's trust, children who vanished without explanation, families destroyed by uncertainty and loss. Luis began working with missing children's organizations, sharing his story in hopes that it might help other families never give up hope. His case was unique. Few abducted children ever returned after so many years, and fewer still retained enough memory to reconstruct what had happened to them. But his survival proved that even the most hopeless cases could have unexpected resolutions. The work was emotionally exhausting, but deeply meaningful. Each time he spoke to a group of parents whose children had vanished, he could see in their faces the same desperation that had once consumed his own family. Most of those children would never return. The statistics were brutal and undeniable, but some might, and for those families, Luis's story offered something precious, proof that miracles were possible. He also began the process of documenting his experience in detail, working with researchers and psychologists to understand the mechanisms by which his identity had been stolen and gradually rebuilt. The case offered unique insights into the psychology of long-term child abduction and the process by which victims could be made to forget their own identities. But even as he shared his story more widely, Luis kept one secret that he had never revealed to anyone, not even Rosa. In the house in Berkeley Hills, during his final confrontation with Clifton, the old man had made one last confession that had shaken Luis to his core. "You weren't the first," Clifton had whispered, "and you weren't the last." The implications of those words had haunted Luis for decades. How many other children had Clifton taken over the years? How many other families had been destroyed by his predatory behavior? How many other Luis Albinos were out there, living under false identities, never knowing who they really were? Luis had tried to investigate on his own, searching through missing children's reports from the decades following his own abduction. But without official resources or law enforcement support, the task was impossible. The truth might be buried forever, along with the man who had created so much suffering. As 2021 dawned, Luis knew that time was running out. He was 76 years old, his health declining, his energy limited. If he was going to find answers to the questions that had haunted him for decades, it would have to be soon. That was when an unexpected phone call changed everything, setting in motion a series of events that would finally bring the full truth about the Luis Albino case into the light and reveal secrets so shocking that they would redefine everything the world thought it knew about one of California's most enduring mysteries. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February 2021, exactly 70 years after Luis had first vanished from that Oakland street. The caller was a DNA genealogist named Sarah Chen, and the words she spoke would set in motion the final chapter of a story that had begun with a 6-year-old boy and a stranger with a promise of puppies. "Mr. Albino," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, "I think I've found something that's going to change everything you thought you knew about your case." The morning fog rolled across San Francisco Bay with the same deliberate patience it had shown 70 years earlier. But the world it revealed had changed beyond recognition. Where once modest homes housed immigrant families scraping together the American dream, now stood gleaming tech offices and boutique coffee shops catering to a new generation of dreamers. The Oakland of Luis Albino's childhood existed only in fragments. A street corner here, an old building there, memories preserved in the minds of those who had witnessed the transformation. Luis Albino sat in his small apartment in San Leandro, surrounded by the carefully organized documentation of a life spent searching for truth. At 76, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body bore the accumulated weight of decades. But his eyes remained sharp with an intelligence that trauma had tested, but never broken. The walls around him were covered with photographs, his reconstructed family history, images of siblings he had found and lost again, children and grandchildren who called him Uncle Luis with the casual affection that still sometimes surprised him. The phone rang at exactly 9:15 a.m., cutting through the quiet of his morning routine with the sharp insistence of possibility. Luis had learned to approach unexpected calls with cautious optimism. At his age, they were as likely to bring bad news as good. But this particular Tuesday carried an energy that felt different from the beginning. "Mr. Albino?" The voice was young, female, vibrating with barely contained excitement. "This is Sarah Chen from Genealogy Solutions. I believe your niece Rosa contacted us about running some DNA comparisons related to your case." Luis felt his pulse quicken. Rosa, now in her 80s but still fiercely protective of her recovered brother, had been exploring every possible avenue to uncover more information about Luis's abduction. The advent of commercial DNA testing had opened new possibilities for solving cold cases, and she had convinced Luis to submit samples to several genetic genealogy companies in hopes of finding unknown relatives or connections to other missing persons cases. "Yes," Luis replied carefully. "What did you find?" Sarah's intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Mr. Albino, I think you need to sit down. What we've discovered is going to change everything you thought you knew about your case." Luis was already sitting, but he gripped the arm of his chair with unconscious force. After 70 years of searching for truth, he had learned to brace himself for revelations that could reshape his understanding of his own life. "We ran your DNA through our databases looking for family connections," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into professional territory. "But what we found instead was something completely unexpected. Your genetic profile has partial matches with at least 6 other individuals in our system. People who were adopted or found as children, people with gaps in their early history, people who have been searching for their biological families." Luis's mind raced to process the implications. 6 other people? 6 that we've identified so far, Sarah corrected. All of them have DNA markers that suggest they could be siblings or half-siblings, but none of them have any record of being related to each other. More importantly, all of them have birth dates and geographic origins that align with missing children cases from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The room seemed to spin around Luis as the full meaning of Sarah's words sank in. Roger Clifton's whispered confession echoed in his memory. "You weren't the first, and you weren't the last." "Are you saying?" Luis began, then stopped, unable to voice the horrifying possibility that was taking shape in his mind. "I'm saying it looks like whoever took you may have taken others," Sarah replied gently. "Many others. And if that's true, then your case isn't just about one missing child. It's about a systematic pattern of abduction that spanned decades." Luis closed his eyes, feeling the weight of revelation settle over him like a shroud. He had spent 50 years believing that his suffering was unique, that Roger Clifton had been a predator who had acted once in a moment of twisted opportunity. The possibility that his abduction had been part of a larger pattern, that other children had endured what he had endured, was almost too overwhelming to process. "I need to see this information," he said finally. "I was hoping you'd say that," Sarah replied. "But Mr. Albino, there's something else, something that makes this even more urgent. 3 of the DNA matches we found are to people who are still alive and searching for their families. If we're right about this, then there are other survivors out there, people like you who were taken as children and raised under false identities." Within hours of Sarah's call, Luis found himself at the center of an investigation that would eventually involve the FBI, local law enforcement agencies across 3 states, and a team of genetic genealogists working around the clock to unravel a conspiracy that had remained hidden for decades. The first breakthrough came when Sarah's team managed to identify one of the DNA matches, a man named David Thompson, 73 years old, living in Portland, Oregon. Thompson had submitted his DNA to the Genealogy service as part of a casual exploration of his heritage, never suspecting that the results would connect him to one of the most complex child abduction cases in California history. When FBI Special Agent Maria Santos called Thompson to inform him of the potential connection, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "I always knew something was wrong," Thompson said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I was raised by my uncle Harold in Seattle, but I never felt like I belonged there. I had dreams, memories that didn't match the stories he told me about my parents dying in a car accident." The parallels to Luis's experience were so exact they sent chills down the spines of everyone involved in the investigation. Like Luis, Thompson had been raised by a man who claimed to be a relative. Like Luis, he had been isolated from outside family connections and trained to accept a false identity from childhood. Like Luis, he had fragments of memory that suggested a different early life. "What was your uncle's name?" Agent Santos asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Harold Clifton," Thompson replied. "He said he was my father's brother." The name hit the investigation team like a physical blow. Harold Clifton, almost certainly a relative of Roger Clifton, possibly even the same man using multiple identities. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and it was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Within days, Agent Santos had assembled a task force dedicated to what was quickly being designated as Operation Family Tree, an investigation into what appeared to be one of the largest child trafficking operations in American history. The case had implications that reached far beyond California, potentially involving abductions across multiple states and spanning several decades. Luis found himself serving as both witness and consultant to the investigation, his unique perspective as a survivor making him invaluable to understanding how the operation had functioned. But the emotional toll of reliving his trauma while learning about others who had suffered similar fates was almost overwhelming. "How many?" he asked Agent Santos during one of their lengthy interviews. "How many children do you think they took?" Santos studied the growing wall of evidence in the FBI field office, photographs of missing children, maps showing geographical patterns, timelines that tracked the movements of the Clifton brothers across the country. The scope was staggering. "We're still putting it together," she replied carefully. "But based on the DNA matches and the missing persons reports we're reviewing, we think it could be dozens, maybe more." The number hit Luis like a physical blow. Dozens of children, stolen from their families, raised under false identities, their true selves systematically erased. The magnitude of the crime was almost impossible to comprehend. As the investigation deepened, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The Clifton brothers, Roger, Harold, and a third man, identified as Robert Clifton, had operated a sophisticated child trafficking network that had functioned for nearly 30 years, from the late 1940s through the mid-90s. Their method was always the same: identify vulnerable children from immigrant or working-class families, study their routines until an opportunity presented itself, then snatch them during moments when supervision was minimal. The children were always taken to different states, given new identities, and raised by one of the brothers under carefully constructed false histories. The psychological manipulation that Luis had experienced was not unique. It was a refined technique that the brothers had perfected over years of practice. They understood exactly how to break down a child's sense of identity and rebuild it according to their specifications, using isolation, gaslighting, and carefully calibrated affection to maintain control. But perhaps most horrifying was the discovery that the operation had been motivated not just by individual psychological compulsions, but by profit. The brothers had been selling some of the children to childless couples willing to pay substantial sums for a baby with no questions asked. Others, like Luis, they had kept for their own twisted purposes. It was a business Agent Santos explained to Luis during one of their meetings. A horrific, systematic business built on the destruction of families. The evidence was overwhelming once investigators knew what to look for. Financial records showed suspicious payments between the brothers over decades. Property records revealed a network of houses in different states where children could be hidden while their identities were being reconstructed. Forged documents created false paper trails that would stand up to casual scrutiny. Most damning of all were the photographs found in Robert Clifton's estate after his death in 1995. Hundreds of images of children over the years, some clearly taken at the moment of abduction, others showing the progression as their appearances were altered and their identities transformed. Luis sat in the FBI conference room staring at a wall covered with these photographs and felt something break inside him. So many faces, so many stolen childhoods, so many families destroyed by the calculated evil of three men who had turned the theft of innocence into a profitable enterprise. "That's me," he said quietly, pointing to a photograph that showed a terrified 6-year-old boy with his hair freshly cut, wearing clothes that weren't his own. "That's the day after they took me." Agent Santos placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry you have to see this, Luis, but your identification is crucial to building the case." "What case?" Luis asked. "They're all dead. Roger died in 1982, Harold in 1987, Robert in 1995. There's no one left to prosecute." "No," Santos agreed. "But there are survivors to find, and families who deserve to know the truth." The first reunion took place on a rainy Thursday in March 2021. David Thompson flew down from Portland to meet Luis in person. Two elderly men whose lives had been shaped by the same unimaginable crime, but who had never known of each other's existence. They met in a conference room at the FBI field office in San Francisco, both men nervous and uncertain about what to expect. Luis arrived first, dressed in his best clothes despite the casual setting, his hands trembling slightly with emotion. Thompson entered a few minutes later, and the moment their eyes met, both men felt a jolt of recognition that transcended logic. "Jesus," Thompson whispered, "you look just like my brother Miguel." Luis felt his breath catch. "You remember Miguel?" "Fragments," Thompson replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I always had these dreams about an older boy who taught me to throw a baseball. Harold told me it was just my imagination, but Miguel was 12 when I was taken," Luis said softly. "He loved baseball." The conversation that followed was both heartbreaking and healing. Two men in their 70s comparing fragments of memory, slowly piecing together the truth about their shared origins. Thompson's real name, they discovered, was Carlos Albino, Luis's older brother, taken 3 years before Luis himself had been abducted. The reunion with Rosa was even more emotional. She was 85 now, confined to a wheelchair but still sharp as a blade. And when Thompson walked into her assisted living facility, she took one look at his face and began to weep. "Carlos," she whispered, reaching out with shaking hands to touch his face. "My God, Carlos, we thought you were dead." "I thought I was an orphan," Thompson replied, kneeling beside her wheelchair. "I've been looking for my family my whole life." The three siblings, Luis, Carlos, and Rosa, spent the next several hours reconstructing their shared history, filling in gaps that had existed for 70 years. Carlos remembered more than Luis had initially, his slightly older age, when taken, having allowed him to retain more concrete memories of their early family life. "Mama used to sing to us in Portuguese," Carlos said, his voice wandering as the memories surfaced. "Something about angels watching over us while we slept." Rosa began to sing, her voice thin but still carrying the melody their mother had used 7 decades earlier. Both men began to cry, recognizing the song from dreams they had never understood. As news of the Clifton investigation spread through law enforcement networks, tips and leads began pouring in from across the country. Families who had lost children decades earlier reached out with information about suspicious characters who had shown interest in their missing loved ones. Adoptees with uncertain histories submitted DNA samples hoping to find connections to the growing database of survivors. The third confirmed survivor was found in Denver, a woman named Patricia Hayes, born Elena Morales in 1948, and taken from her family in Phoenix when she was 4 years old. Like Luis and Carlos, she had been raised by one of the Clifton brothers under a false identity, told that her parents had died in an accident and that her uncle was her only remaining family. Patricia's reunion with her surviving relatives, two elderly sisters who had never stopped searching for their missing baby sister, was covered by news outlets across the country. The story of the Clifton network was becoming national news, inspiring other families to come forward with their own experiences of suspicious adoptions and mysterious disappearances from decades past. "We're dealing with something unprecedented," Agent Santos told the media during a press conference in April 2021. "This appears to be the largest systematic child trafficking operation ever uncovered in the United States. We believe there may be dozens of survivors still out there, living under false identities, who don't even know they were abducted." The press conference included Luis, Carlos, and Patricia, three elderly survivors whose mere existence proved that even the most hopeless missing persons cases could have unexpected resolutions. Luis found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, his story becoming a symbol of both the cruelty humans could inflict on each other and the resilience of the human spirit in overcoming unimaginable trauma. But even as the investigation uncovered more survivors and reunited more families, Luis was haunted by a devastating realization. For every child they found alive, there were others who had died without ever learning their true identities, others whose families had given up hope decades earlier, others whose stories would never be fully told. The most shocking discovery came in June 2021, when investigators found a cache of documents hidden in a safety deposit box that had belonged to Robert Clifton. The box contained detailed records of the brothers' operation, including financial ledgers, contact information for buyers, and most horrifyingly, a catalog of available children complete with photographs and descriptions. The documents revealed that the Clifton network had operated on a scale that dwarfed even the FBI's worst estimates. Over nearly 30 years, they had been responsible for the abduction of at least 87 children, most of whom had been sold to buyers across the country and internationally. They treated children like merchandise, Agent Santos explained to Luis during a private briefing. They had prices based on age, appearance, and perceived intelligence. They offered guarantees that the children's backgrounds could never be traced. Luis stared at the ledger pages, seeing row after row of entries that reduced human beings to commercial transactions. His own entry was there. Luis A., age 6, Portuguese-Mexican mix, $3,500 to R. Clifton for personal use. The casual nature of the notation, the reduction of his entire identity to a few lines in a business ledger, was almost more devastating than anything else he had learned about his ordeal. "How many buyers have you identified?" he asked. 43 so far, Santos replied. "Most of them are dead now, but we're tracking down their families, trying to identify children who may have been purchased rather than legitimately adopted." The investigation had become a massive genealogical puzzle, with DNA evidence, adoption records, and financial documents all being cross-referenced to identify potential victims. Each new connection led to more questions, more potential survivors, more families who might finally learn the truth about children who had vanished decades earlier. While the Clifton brothers themselves were beyond the reach of legal justice, their network had involved dozens of accomplices, lawyers who had created false documents, doctors who had provided fake medical histories, social workers who had been bribed to overlook suspicious adoptions. Many of these individuals were still alive, and as evidence mounted, federal prosecutors began building cases against them. The first arrests came in July 2021. Dr. Martin Hendricks, now 89, and living in a Phoenix retirement community, was charged with conspiracy and fraud for his role in creating false medical records for abducted children. Attorney Jessica Morrison, 76, faced similar charges for her work in facilitating illegal adoptions. Social worker Thomas Ray, 72, was arrested for accepting bribes to falsify adoption paperwork. For Louise, watching these elderly conspirators being led away in handcuffs provided a sense of justice that he had never expected to experience. They were not the primary perpetrators. Those men had escaped earthly justice by dying decades earlier, but they had enabled the machinery that had destroyed so many lives. "It's not enough," he told Agent Santos as they watched news coverage of the arrests. "Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what they did." "No," Santos agreed, "but it's something, and for the families who never got closure, it's proof that the truth eventually comes to light." As 2021 progressed, the investigation continued to expand. New DNA matches were identified weekly, leading to more potential survivors and more devastating family reunions. Support groups were established for the growing community of people whose lives had been touched by the Clifton Network. Survivors, family members, adoptees seeking their true identities, and law enforcement personnel struggling to process the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Luis found himself serving as an unofficial spokesman for the survivors, traveling to speak with other families and sharing his story at conferences dedicated to missing children cases. The work was emotionally exhausting but deeply meaningful. Each time he spoke, he could see recognition in the eyes of audience members who had lived with their own unexplained memories and fragmented identities. One of the most powerful moments came during a conference in Chicago, when a woman in her 60s approached him after his presentation. "I think I might be one of them," she said quietly. "I was raised by my aunt after my parents supposedly died in a fire, but I've never been able to find any record of that fire. And listening to you talk, I remember Portuguese songs, just like you described." The woman, who had lived her entire life as Margaret Sullivan, submitted DNA samples that confirmed she was indeed Maria Albino, Luis and Carlos's sister, taken when she was 8 years old. The reunion of three siblings who had been separated for 70 years made headlines around the world, becoming a symbol of hope for other families dealing with missing loved ones. But for every joyful reunion, there were reminders of the lives that had been lost forever. DNA matches to deceased individuals who had died without ever knowing their true identities. Families who had given up searching decades earlier, only to learn that their loved ones had been alive but unreachable. Children who had been sold to buyers whose identities might never be known. By the end of 2021, investigators had identified 43 confirmed survivors of the Clifton Network, ranging in age from their late 60s to early 80s. 31 families had been reunited with relatives they had believed dead. 12 of the network's accomplices had been arrested and charged with various crimes related to their participation in the conspiracy. But perhaps most importantly, the investigation had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached cold cases involving missing children. The Clifton case proved that even decades-old disappearances could be solved through modern DNA technology and dedicated investigative work. Luis, now 77 and increasingly frail, found himself reflecting on the strange arc of his life. He had spent his childhood believing he was Johnny Clifton, his middle years discovering he was Luis Albino, and his final years learning that his story was part of something much larger and more horrific than he had ever imagined. "Do you have any regrets?" a journalist asked him during one of his final interviews. Luis considered the question carefully. "I regret that my parents died without knowing I was alive," he said finally. "I regret that so many other children suffered what I suffered. I regret that it took 70 years for the truth to come out. But do you regret surviving? Do you wish you had never learned the truth?" "No," Luis replied without hesitation. "The truth is always better than a lie, even when it hurts. And knowing that I helped other families find their children, that makes everything worthwhile." Luis Albino died peacefully in his sleep on February 21, 2022, exactly 71 years to the day after his abduction. He was surrounded by family members he had spent decades searching for, in a room filled with photographs that told the story of a life reclaimed against impossible odds. His obituary, published in newspapers across the country, described him not as a victim, but as a survivor whose courage in sharing his story had led to one of the largest criminal investigations in FBI history. The Luis Albino Foundation, established in his honor, continues to work with law enforcement agencies and genetic genealogists to identify survivors of historic child trafficking operations. The final statistics of the Clifton investigation were staggering. 87 confirmed abductions, 43 survivors identified, 68 families reunited with missing relatives, and a network of accomplices that had reached into adoption agencies, law firms, medical practices, and social services departments across 12 states. But for those who had known Luis personally, the numbers mattered less than the man himself, a person who had endured unimaginable trauma and emerged with his capacity for love and hope intact. He had spent the last years of his life helping others find their way home, becoming a beacon of possibility for families who had never given up searching. Rosa Albino, who died 6 months after her brother, left behind a letter that was read at a memorial service attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the Clifton investigation. "My little brother Luis was taken from us when he was 6 years old, but he never stopped trying to find his way home. It took him 70 years, but he made it. And in making it home himself, he showed dozens of other lost children the way back to their families. That is his legacy, not the terrible things that were done to him, but the beautiful things he did for others once he was free." The Berkeley Hills house where Luis had spent most of his childhood was demolished in 2023, replaced by a small park that features a memorial to the victims of the Clifton network. The bronze plaque at its center bears a simple inscription: "In memory of all the children who were lost, and in honor of those who found their way home." The Clifton case changed more than just the lives of the immediate survivors and their families. It revolutionized how law enforcement agencies approach cold cases, leading to the establishment of genetic genealogy units in FBI field offices across the country. It inspired new legislation requiring better oversight of private adoptions and more rigorous documentation of children's origins. Most importantly, it proved that no case is ever truly hopeless, that families should never stop searching, and that the truth has a way of surfacing even when it has been buried for decades. Today, the techniques pioneered during the Clifton investigation are being used to solve missing persons cases around the world. DNA databases continue to grow, making new connections possible each day. And somewhere in cities and towns across America, elderly people are learning that the fragments of memory they've carried their entire lives aren't fantasies or dreams. They're pieces of stolen identities waiting to be reclaimed. The story of Luis Albino began with a 6-year-old boy walking into the fog on an Oakland street in 1951. It ended with an elderly man surrounded by the family he had spent a lifetime trying to find. Proof that love is stronger than cruelty, that truth is more persistent than lies, and that home is not a place, but a connection that transcends time, distance, and even the most deliberate attempts to destroy it. In the end, Luis Albino did make it home, and in doing so, he lit a path that dozens of other lost children would follow, proving that even the most impossible journeys can end in reunion, healing, and hope.